I've been seeing a lot of videos recently by a YouTuber named Bannercoot. He makes a lot of videos on video games, but the main ones that I'm focused on are these videos he's been titling Bizarre Food Economies of Blank. Really fantastic videos. It scratches the part of my brain that's really obsessed with knowing a lot about food. I love knowing about like origins of food, food sciences, and then just, cooking in general. So to delve into all these different worlds and discuss their food and how that works in the world is very fascinating to me. Although personally, I wouldn't necessarily call it economies of this world. It does feel a little bit more like how it, does the world building, especially the way he frames it, but I don't think that's necessarily an interesting title. Then that got me to think, of course, because I see everything through the lens of D&D, about how I can incorporate food or like look at media with food and incorporate those ideas of, food and how it can further develop my world. Then that got me to think about the fact that I have a bunch of themed cookbooks. It's something that I personally like to collect. For my D&D nights, I used to always pick one or two items out of these themed cookbooks, usually they're fantasy related or just video game related, and then cook that for the group. Recently, not so much. Grocery prices are expensive and I can't feed 8 people, the complicated meals outside of a cookbook. The original idea was to go into each of my cookbooks, read, the text in between, the stories for each of the, if there's like zones that they're trying to talk about, like read the actual text, not the recipes. Because I felt like I was kind of underutilizing the books a little bit. And then I actually read all that information. I went through the first Heroes Feast book, and I read through all of the side texts. I read through the front, of each of the races. They're talking about like halfling culture, human culture, things like that. And then I read all the texts about like the flavor text for the recipes themselves. And honestly, I don't really know what I was expecting. I, for some reason, got in my head to think that these books about food would really talk about like the lore of the food for some reason, but it was really just talking about the flavors on most of them. There were a few interesting tidbits across like a bit of the books, like notes about how human culture, they don't especially because this is like we're assuming D&D fantasy rules, human culture, they don't slow cook their food as much because they're much shorter lived than a lot of the other races. That makes sense. So like their slow cooking is hours versus days. That's an interesting tidbit. There were some tidbits about like, oh, you can only get this fish in this area. That's interesting. And, kind of pointed out the fact that like halfling food is very much separated into small dishes that they have a lot of because they eat multiple times in the day versus like big meals. There just wasn't a lot of that, and honestly that doesn't even really scratch like as much of what I would personally want. So I stopped reading the books because that was kind of what I ended up expecting. I was like, oh, these are food writers. These are not like world builders, which makes a lot of sense actually. I don't know why I didn't click in my head before. So I'm gonna go back to my tried and true and just go back to different forms of media, primarily, video games, shows and things like that, to try and look at things that I think would represent how food can really build out a world. Because what I really want to find is a semblance of a world that has just food and it feels intentional why it's there. Because of course, in a world where everyone's got to eat, or for the most part, what kind of cultures form around that? Are people just eating for subsistence? Are people eating for, celebrations? Are they eating for pleasure? Like, why are they eating? What does food mean to them? Because that is really interesting. In the world of The Last of Us and other apocalyptic media, food is very often scarce. There's no economies of scale, there's no big farming, there's no agriculture. So people often are scavenging for what they can. Food is very limited and they're cooking whatever they can actually find. And then there's also the element of the world has lost a lot. So there are people from like the old world who, often have like nostalgia for how things once were, and that can be built through food. At the very start of the game, you immediately get a glimpse of what this world is like after the world has fallen. There are people who, they're rationing out food. They have ration tickets, and even those ration tickets are slowly becoming less and less valuable as they are getting less and less food. So people kind of ended up having to rely on scavenging if they had to, leaving the city. There are people who hunt their fellow men. There are people desperate enough to do that because they just want to survive. And then there's also people who are, willing to raid around, probably trade in ration tickets for a fried rat, a grilled rat. Just with that, you end up kind of getting a very clear idea of what this world's relationship with food is. They set it up very clearly. And I think food is a really great way to get that across, because yes, it's apocalyptic, but to see people struggle with food, I think that's something that we can very inherently understand of what it's like to be hungry and not to know maybe where the next meal is going to come from. And you can really see that with all these people here. They are desperate, their food is running out. There's no opulence, there's no excess like we have today. There's struggle, and every single meal is a struggle with them. And I think they get that across using food excellently. You can even catch remarks from a few characters talking about like things that they miss. Very notably, very early in the game, when Joel is in the hotel with Ellie and they're exploring, you find an old coffee machine, and Joel remarks that he misses coffee.
I really miss coffee.
So you get a sense that there's no, coffee agriculture anymore, which makes sense, of course. But to hear someone talk about how they miss it also makes us feel what the old world must have been like, or what people valued before and now they miss. You can kind of build that with food because that's very easy.
Did you go to coffee shops a lot?
I did. All the time.
And what would you get?
Just coffee.
We've all probably had a snack or something that has disappeared and gone away, and now, there's that lingering feeling. Everyone talks about those like blue Scooby-Doo snack gummies that they don't really make anymore. You get a very similar feeling in games like Fallout, of course, another apocalyptic media where food is scarce. But you also get an idea of what the old world was like, because there is so much pre-world food. A lot of it is going on about the fact that these people were expecting war, so they made food that would last. And of course, it did last. It lasted until the current times in the games, where you could eat, 100-year-old like spam, basically. That kind of builds and talks about what was lost in the pre-world, what people were eating in the new world. And then of course you find vendors who are eating like iguanas, things like that, just eating what they can. And you also see kind of the desperation people have to find like clean water and things like that. There's like water purifiers in a lot of the vaults. How do you get hands on that technology? Because it's very, very valuable. That all kind of, again, builds onto that feeling. It's a small thing, but I think food is really important because everyone has to eat and everyone understands it pretty intrinsically. And then going on to like just the pleasure thing, there's probably not a lot of like foods that you can eat for pleasure when you're in apocalypse, which is why I think that like Nuka-Cola feels so big. It's because it's probably like the one few treats that people can find if they actually do find it. And then food and media in general can just kind of impact how you feel. It evokes emotions out of you. For example, in Lord of the Rings, you kind of get a feeling of bewilderment by how the halflings have 1,000 meals versus like the humans and like the elves. And you can also just immediately tell that all their cultures are different, because the elves, they have the lembas bread that says they can kind of fuel their bodies for forever. And the halflings ate like so many of them. And then also just you could feel such visceral feelings from seeing people eat, like how Denethor eating those tomatoes was the most disgusting thing I have ever witnessed. But even just with that, you can get a sense that in this world, food is very important. The halflings make a big deal about when are we going to eat all these breakfasts while they're on their travels, because that's a really important part of their culture. And you get that sold just by how they eat. It differs from how we generally eat in our, modern world. So that contrast of like what we understand as our mealtime and theirs is very, very apparent. Going into books, book-wise, one of my favorite series is the Stormlight Archive. So the Way of Kings. In that book, there is the empire called the Alethi, and there is the belief that men should be eating spiced foods and the women are eating mild foods. It feels weird to gender foods, but that's just one way you can really represent how this society is different and how you build their beliefs. Just with that, you kind of get a sense of what they believe that like men and women should be. Because I think that actually putting into your world building what different groups eat, even if it's just a cultural thing, or even if it's like a limitation, what do they eat? Because that tells you a lot about what the society is. For example, what do the rich eat in a certain world? What do the poor eat? What do the people in the East eat? What do people in the West eat? What do people in this city versus that city kind of eat? All that kind of really helps describe how this world functions, and I think that is a really fun thing to delve into. I think you could see examples of that in our own real life. You know, for example, a lot of seafoods, lobsters, were considered food for the poor. Now they're like a luxury. A lot of foods that we think are pretty common now were harder to come by, especially before we had these giant economies of scale. Think like oranges used to be kind of luxuries that people would have because they're fruits from somewhere where you don't easily have access to. That is something that kind of, I don't know, just fleshes out like the world, like what can people afford to eat. And then also just think about like how food has traveled. You know, for example, like Vietnamese food has a lot of French influence. Creole food has a lot of French influence as well. Filipino has a lot of, you know, Spanish influences. There are just influences all across different foods because they have traveled a lot of places. One not so fun example is like American barbecue. Barbecue was, you know, brought over to the States by not so great practices that, you know, a few of the founding, you know, people who founded this country probably brought along with them. And then there's things like Korean army stew, right? The Korean stew that's made of a bunch of like canned meats and things like that that you would find at Korean army bases. And it's a struggle food. A lot of great foods come from struggle, from terrible things, and I think the same things could happen in a world. Then think about like foods that you also only eat on special occasions, birthday cakes, like holiday foods like turkeys, you know, fruit cakes that I've never heard anyone actually say they like stuffing, gingerbread. All those different things are tied to our culture, and you can kind of use that as reference to make just to make like worlds that feel a little bit more lived in. How do you actually incorporate this into your D&D world, or you know, just like your world building setting? I think it's good to focus on 3 things. So the first thing is going to be who actually has access to the food, what do people believe about the food, and then what do they actually grow or produce in the area that you're focusing on. The most important thing, and I think the one that might get themes across the best really, is generally who has access to foods. For example, if you're starting like an adventure with like a level 1 party, level 3 party, you might be stopping off at like a tavern that doesn't necessarily have a lot of funding. They can't get you like fresh fruits, things like that, because that might be a little difficult for them. Or they might just get you what fruits they grow in their local area. But you know, vegetables and things like that are going to be limited, especially when you're going somewhere that is, you know, somewhere where it's like a little bit starting off. They don't have access to all these resources. And then you could also use food as kind of like a status thing for these characters. You know, as they move on in the world, they start having dinners with kings or nobles, things like that. The food that they're eating could be a significant, you know, upgrade. And if you really wanted to hammer that across, you could technically probably start like throwing in mechanical benefits for eating better food. I haven't thought too much on that. I've had a few, you know, systems where like special tailored food, you know, gives buffs to players. But for the most part, I think just even describing the fact that they are eating these like fancier foods, and you don't have to think about what foods are fancy in that world. You can just copy what's fancy in the real world if you really want to. But that would be an option. And then go into just what like the people in this world actually believe about the foods. For example, like in our real world, a lot of people believed that tomatoes were toxic when they were first introduced. That could be something that could exist in a world where people are introduced to these foods and they don't think that they're safe, things like that. And then also like what kind of foods do they eat on holidays? That would be really important because they probably have a lot of beliefs about that, like what food should be eaten during certain celebrations. That all just builds into like cultures of the world. And then also just adding on to holidays in general. Holidays are very often formed from some kind of religious procedure. So what kind of religions formed beliefs about foods as well? Maybe if this group of people, you know, grow primarily potatoes, maybe they have some kind of potato deity that they believe will bring like good harvests. Things as simple as that really builds out what these people believe, and I think it's a good springboard to actually make a lot of the rest of the world. Okay, I don't have too many personal examples, honestly, for this one. I haven't done like a lot of like food world building in my current games. I do want to do a little bit more of that. Do my players personally care? I don't really think so, but this is something for me because one part of the fact that I am a DM is the fact that I just like writing stuff. Even if my players never interact with that, I just like having the idea that, hey, this place makes this kind of food, this place makes this kind of food, and that's fun for me. If my players find that fun, that's a bonus, but that's for me. And I think hopefully this kind of struck a chord with a few other people, and if you have ever kind of experienced kind of food in media that got you thinking for whatever reason, maybe you've bought a cookbook of your own, feel free to let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear about that. But thank you so much for watching. I'm just rambling about food, and I think it's really cool. Honestly, I think one of the best representations of food I've ever seen, not necessarily for world building, was just the instant ramen from Ghibli's Ponyo. That changed my life. I don't know why, it just looked so good. All right,